Up until the 21st century, multiplayer online role-playing games were confined to personal and mainframe computers. Whether you looked at Orthanc or EverQuest, you were looking at a game designed to run on a multi-purpose computer, not dedicated gaming hardware. But the popularity of the video game console throughout the 1980s and 90s exceeded that of the personal computer, with industry analysts like the Interactive Digital Software Association forecasting at the beginning of the new millennium that up to 70% of households would own a next-generation game console by 2005. At the time these reports were being made, personal computer ownership was hovering just around 50%, and many of those computers were low-end, underpowered machines, not capable of handling the latest games or even polygonal graphics. These circumstances were exacerbated in Japan, where after the collapse of the domestic computer market, much of the country did not adapt to Windows or Mac-based home computers, but instead interacted with computers primarily in business environments. Moreover, the consoles in development at the end of the 1990s were all planned to have some form of internet connectivity available to them. So to Japanese game developers in 1999, it made a great deal of sense to plan for bringing online role-playing to console in 2000. And the game that would kick this off was none other than Sega's Phantasy Star Online.
The whole world, communication,
collaboration,
fighting,
not fighting,
light,
darkness,
internet, a new world.
Created from the ground up for the Dreamcast home console and its built-in modem, PSO was the brainchild of Sonic Team, Sega's most prominent developer. Sonic Team had previously created Choo Choo Rocket as a proof of concept for the Dreamcast's online capabilities, and also implemented network features to the North American release of Sonic Adventure. The Dreamcast modem plugged directly into the user's phone line like any other dial-up device. Japanese modems downloaded at 33.6 kilobits per second, while American and European modems went up to 56K. Because of the lower limit on Japanese Dreamcast modems, games released in Japan had to be designed for a lower information threshold, and Phantasy Star Online was no exception. Moreover, dial-up connections could be unreliable, with periodic disconnects pulling players out of the game. PSO's brand of multiplayer was designed with this in mind, facilitating sessions of broken-up dungeon runs rather than taxingly long raids as EverQuest and prior online RPGs did. Sega's Phantasy Star franchise had a long history going back to the late 1980s, but PSO didn't start out as a revival of it. Instead, Sonic Team codenamed the game Third World and created the concept and structure of the online game first, deciding which Sega franchise it would best fit after much of the initial work was complete. Thus, Third World, the science fiction dungeon crawler where players banded together in parties of up to 4, mapped out a dungeon, unlocked doors, and farmed loot, took on the aesthetics of existing dungeon crawler Phantasy Star, adopting its version of magic spells like the Resta and Barda techniques, its 3 races of human, Newman, and caste, certain monsters like the Rappy and Grass Assassin, and the centralizing storyline element Dark Force, thereby becoming Phantasy Star Online. The structure of PSO came from an unlikely place: Blizzard Entertainment's 1996 PC game, Diablo. Diablo was the first loot-driven action RPG, with players navigating a procedurally generated dungeon slaying monsters and scrounging for randomly rolled equipment, and had a limited online mode in which 2 players could explore the dungeon cooperatively. However, the PC version of Diablo was never actually released in Japan. Japanese users instead experienced it through its offline-only PlayStation port. Sonic Team leader Nakayuzi studied a number of different online games in order to prepare for PSO's creation, including Ultima Online, EverQuest, and Diablo. Of the 3, Diablo had the most console-like gameplay, as its hunt for better gear was inherently rewarding from the outset rather than stymied by a slow early game leveling experience. While Naka had never commented on why exactly he chose Diablo, it was most likely this aspect that made it an attractive template. The smaller scale gameplay was better suited to the hardware limitations of the time. And with the Dreamcast's impressive texturing abilities, it was possible to create a much higher fidelity game than Diablo while still preserving the core gameplay. Unlike in Diablo, players in PSO could progress online and offline with the same character, and their online progress was actually linked to their offline play. At launch, the game had 4 dungeons: Forest, Caves, Mines, and Ruins, and an online party could only go as far as the party leader had unlocked. The offline mode thus served both to make the game playable for those without internet and as a kind of introduction to the game mechanics, done in the safety of a single-player game where newbies could learn how to time their attacks and use their techniques. 4 dungeons might sound like an incredibly small number now, but PSO made substantive changes to the dungeons as the player progressed to higher difficulty levels, starting on normal and eventually unlocking the hard, very hard, and in later revisions the ultimate difficulty, which changed not just the monsters and their distribution, but also replaced each of the boss monsters and their arenas with retextured versions carrying new movesets and different loot. In addition to just doing normal dungeon runs, players could also take on quests together that featured their own layouts and objectives and sometimes connected areas that were never linked in the main game. While PC games had several dozen keys to fall back on when designing a control scheme, PSO had to be designed with the idea that most players would only have a gamepad for input. To that end, the entire game system was tailored to making both gameplay and communication as easy as possible. Players could create their own messages using the on-screen keyboard and assign them to button shortcuts to use those messages instantly, or create messages from pre-made templates that would be automatically translated for other users depending on their own language settings. Or they could use the symbol chat feature, assembling graphical symbols to create their own animated emoticons. These communication methods were created for a single server environment where Japanese, English, German, French, and Spanish-speaking players would all be sharing the same lobbies, so players could take advantage of the universality of the game's symbols and the auto-translation features to smoothly create parties and coordinate on their dungeon runs regardless of language barriers. The in-game guild card system further allowed players to create a friend list and keep track of their most trusted allies and send messages to them, all through their Dreamcasts. The battle system was likewise designed around the Dreamcast gamepad, with all of the player's possible actions being represented in a customizable action palette that visually mapped to the Dreamcast's button layout. Players could toggle through 2 different palettes with the right trigger, allowing up to 6 actions to be set at once, each of which had a universal cross-language icon rather than a textual name. When PSO was later ported to the Nintendo GameCube, this interface was updated to match the new button layout, and when it came to PC, the palette was supplemented by a 3rd set of icons mapped to the number keys. Beyond just adapting play control for gamepads, PSO also presented players with a more user-friendly world than its predecessors. Consider how the player starts off in Ultima Online and EverQuest. They have an inventory, but they don't have a weapon equipped, and the structure of the maps do nothing to guide the player's progress. In PSO, the player starts with weapons and armor already on, and the level geometry instructs them on how to proceed. Interacting with terminals to unlock gates and toggle barriers, destroying objects to find treasure, interfacing with red keys to open red doors and blue keys to open blue ones. The world of Raggle in 2000 was self-explanatory, in a way that Britannia and Norath were not. The character progression behind the game was just as carefully tailored to its control scheme and level design. When players first started a new game in Phantasy Star Online, they were presented with their initial class choice, which was really a combination of 3 classes, 3 races, and 2 sexes. The Hunter, Ranger, and Force classes, mixed with the Human, Newman, and Caste races, each being male or female. In all versions of the game, the cursor defaulted to the Hunter Human Male, or Humar, and the next option was the Hunter Newman Female, or Hunural. These choices were not incidental, but deliberately arranged so that the new character options defaulted to the characters that were optimal for offline, solo play. The Humar and Hunural had access to a broad set of melee and ranged weapons, attack magic, and healing techniques, which made them the most self-sufficient. They were the easiest ones to both solo with and jump into a group with, because they could fulfill different roles easily, making them ideal for new players still trying to figure out what they wanted to specialize in. They would never do any of these roles as well as one of the more specialized classes, but they were perfect for trying different ones out. At the original level cap of 100, The Humar and Huneural had nearly identical all-around great stats, with the highest attack power and defense, and passable mental strength and above-average attack accuracy. Later revisions of the game would increase the cap to 200 and rebalance the final stats to significantly nerf these classes, but they remained effective tools for teaching new players the ropes. The dungeons in PSO were not actually generated on the fly as they were in Diablo. In most dungeons, the actual room layout and polygonal structure did not change at all, but the player's starting and ending positions, the distribution of mobs, and the placement of locked doors and treasure crates were chosen from preset configurations. The actual contents of those crates, and of the monster's random drops, were randomly chosen from a table based on the player's section ID, which was determined by their name during character creation. The section ID system served to encourage a vibrant trading economy, with players setting up shop in lobbies negotiating to trade their rare drops and in-game money. The gear itself was just as diverse as the class and dungeon systems. In addition to giving stat bonuses like additional attack and attack accuracy, weapons in Phantasy Star Online also had affinities, colloquially called percents by players. Each enemy belonged to one of 4 attributes: native, altered beast, machine, or dark, and higher percents multiplied the amount of damage dealt to enemies of those attributes. Weapons could even have negative percents, multiplying damage down so that some weapons would be explicitly bad against that affinity. So rather than a straight stat treadmill like later online RPGs, in PSO gear progressed in multiple directions simultaneously. It could have higher raw stat bonuses or better percents, or a different special attack inflicting a particular status like experience drain, stun, or freezing. While PSO had a lobby-based structure where players met up in a central meeting area to form parties that then ran dungeons together, the structure itself was designed to be as unintrusive as possible. There was only one server. Every time the player logged in, they could log into any of the ships on the server and any of the blocks therein. And even while on different blocks and ships, if they had another player's guild card, they could send them an instant message. Ironically, this made the game better at facilitating bonds and connections between players than some actual MMORPGs on the market 20 years down the line. The player was never restricted by the database shard their character was in, because their character wasn't tied to the shard, it was tied to the console. As a result of all these factors, PSO managed to feel like a much bigger world than it really was, replicating the feeling of exploration, progress, and openness despite not actually being an open-world MMO. You could only call it a massively multiplayer game by the furthest stretch of the imagination. The lobbies were capped at 100 players each, dungeons were what we would today call instanced in that only your own party could enter, and you could not encounter other players in the wild, and parties were limited to a maximum of 4 players simultaneously. However, PSO took strides to replicate as closely as possible the kinds of experiences players were having in actual MMOs. The depth of the game's character creator wasn't surpassed for another 2 years after it came out. Being able to select any ship to log into at startup ensured they could always play with their friends no matter which ship they were originally on. Players could have truly global experiences interacting with one another in other countries through the auto-translated word select or symbol chat, and the robbery and player killing of real MMOs was fully present in PSO, at least at the start. At launch, players could use friendly fire to backstab each other in dungeons and steal the other player's equipped weapon when it dropped, which the game's version 2 revision spun off into a separate game mode. Even in later versions of the game, the lack of direct menu-to-menu item trading enabled incredible heists because players had to drop items on the ground to trade them, and color-coded boxes could be easily substituted by a lower quality item of the same color, and players would at times create elaborate long-running scams to con each other out of rare drops. So the massiveness of PSO wasn't really an issue in 2000. From a Japanese perspective, the term MMORPG was at the time extremely obscure terminology. Japan had never gotten multi-user dungeons, and milestone network games popular in the rest of the world like Doom, Quake, and StarCraft suffered from limited availability or were just not localized in Japanese. Although network infrastructure was cutting edge, home PC use was highly limited. Very few people were using the internet outside of a business setting, and in general, network gaming just hadn't taken off yet. Even hardcore gamers tended not to distinguish between an MMO and any other online game. All of them were referred to as netoge, network games, and this terminology persisted in Japan for the next 20 years. When Kawahara Reki wrote Sword Art Online in 2002, his use of the term MMORPG designated the protagonist as exceptionally nerdy, even among otaku, and the novel's later print publication in 2009 helped introduce the term to the Japanese mainstream. As late as 2017, the popular web manga and TV anime series Recovery of an MMO Junkie never actually used the term MMORPG in its Japanese release. It was instead called Netoju no Susume, Recommendation of the Net Life, and the focal MMO was always referred to as a netoge, because your average Japanese person still doesn't really know what an MMO is, but they do know netoge, online games. Back in 2000, it wasn't just that PSO wasn't an MMO, it was that from both the perspective of the game's creators and primary target audience, MMORPG wasn't a genre. Phantasy Star Online was the same genre as Choo Choo Rocket, Counter-Strike, and EverQuest. To a country that didn't have that many online games available to it, where being online could be a genre feature in and of itself, all of these were simply netoge. Overseas, PSO was still marketed as an MMO, despite not really being one at heart, with Sega famously claiming that the gaming population would be the entire population. At the time, about 6 billion people. In reality, the actual player base of PSO was much smaller, though still outstripping most actual MMOs. In the first month alone, there were 500,000 active subscriptions in Japan, and after launching in the United States, over 1.5 million players. This grew as the game expanded to more platforms, though the servers were not cross-platform. PSO was followed by version 2 on the Dreamcast, episode 1 and 2, and episode 1 and 2 Plus on the GameCube and Xbox, and ultimately Blue Burst on PC. Sales tracking group NPD pinned the life-to-date sales of episode 1 and 2 in 2005 at just over 190,000 units on GameCube, plus 21,000 more for Plus and 68,000 on Xbox, putting the game's known sales across all versions as of 2005 somewhere around 1.8 to 2 million copies, which at the time was only surpassed by EverQuest in the world of online role-playing. That success should not be taken lightly. Particularly in Japan, Phantasy Star Online was responsible for popularizing much of the financial infrastructure that would prove essential to the success of later games like Ragnarok Online, MapleStory, and Mabinogi. While in the Western world version 1 was famous for having no subscription cost, in Japan PSO charged money from the beginning. Players got 30 days free with their purchase of the game, but after that period expired would have to renew their subscription either monthly for 400 yen, or every 3 months for 1,000 yen. Currency converted and adjusted for inflation, that would be about $6 a month or $15 for 3 months. When PSO came to GameCube in 2002 as episodes 1 and 2, it once again came with 30 free days, after which players would have to pay 600 yen per month or 1,500 for 3. And when PSO Blue Burst came to PC in 2004, Sega exclusively offered a 1,050 yen monthly fee as the only subscription option, though the actual Blue Burst disc cost about a third of what its console releases had. The problem with this pricing structure was not in convincing players to pay for it, but in figuring out how they would pay for it. Sonic Team viewed Japan as the primary market for PSO and treated additional revenue beyond that as a bonus. But Japan was and is a largely cash-only society. Credit and debit card processing fees are high, small family-run businesses are everywhere, trust in banks is low because of the decades of financial decline, you're never more than 3 feet away from an ATM, and crime rates are some of the lowest in the world, making it completely safe to walk around Tokyo with 100,000 yen in your wallet. How do you get a country where no one uses credit cards in a time period when PayPal and Venmo don't exist yet to buy a subscription online? Sega's solution was to partner with the Japanese startup WebMoney to create a line of prepaid cards users could buy in convenience stores and game shops to pay for their PSO sub. These were not just plain prepaid cards, but had custom designs featuring PSO characters and monsters, making them into collectibles with a utility. WebMoney would go on to partner with Square Enix, Nexon, and many other companies seeking to monetize online RPGs in Japan's cash-only economy. And to this day, you can get prepaid cards for Phantasy Star Online 2, featuring the game's most popular characters. While the Dreamcast's lack of a large internal storage meant PSO couldn't be expanded upon in the way that online RPGs before and after it could, it did receive numerous revisions in its own lifetime. After the original Dreamcast run, Sonic Team created episodes 1 and 2 for the Nintendo GameCube, and the titular episode 2 was an all-new storyline with 4 new dungeons and their own associated quests, and these new dungeons and bosses were tailored to the hardware capabilities of the GameCube. featuring zones like a flooded temple, a coastal jungle, and an undersea laboratory going all the way down to the ocean floor. Similar to other water-heavy games like The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker, Star Fox Adventures, and Super Mario Sunshine, the focus on Episode 2 was bringing out the particular abilities of the GameCube, and like those games, PSO used texture and shader effects that were exclusive to the Cube and couldn't be carried forward to future versions. Due to an oversight, Episode 1 and 2 became the cornerstone of the first major GameCube hack, as players could use the disc to trick the system into executing arbitrary code by connecting to their computers as if they were a server. This bug, along with several others, was fixed in the updated re-release Episode 1 and 2 Plus, which was also used as the basis for an Xbox port. The GameCube and Xbox ports of PSO both featured split-screen multiplayer for local co-op play, a unique feature that didn't carry over to the game's final version. The 2004 PC release Blue Burst instead added a third episode, confusingly titled Episode 4. Episode 3 was a totally different game released exclusively on GameCube, which featured turn-based card battles using a movement grid pulled right out from the strategy RPG genre. While the PC version is often lifted up as the definitive one, as an anti-cheat mechanism it was missing the option to play offline. Today there are dozens of private servers in different countries and languages. While the Blue Burst server Ephenea is the most popular, one of the reasons the Dreamcast and GameCube versions of the game have endured is that players can retain their characters and connect to a variety of different servers, whether that's Silverant and Shithack in North America, or Izakaya and Kazuha in Japan. Each of these servers have developed their own culture and player communities, as well as house rules like experience modifiers or new item drop systems modeled on the sequel. Officially, Phantasy Star Online died in 2008, but in the deep darkness of the net, it's lived on as an eternal and undying community, held together by a mutual love for the game and a force of will to preserve its moment in time forever. So what made PSO work? In a nutshell, it was a game about running dungeons to get better gear, filled with subsystems that enhanced that gear, all contributing to an easily understandable and inherently desirable core objective. Allying with other people was essentially another subsystem for improving gear, and it gave parties a common goal to work toward that encouraged class diversity to minimize squabbling over drops. Unlike a lot of later games that attempted this and failed, the gear the player acquired was immediately useful, no crafting required, and the level geometry itself facilitated all of this with visually legible information about how to proceed. By the standards of the 2020s, the game is very bare bones. It had no player housing, no overworld, a threadbare storyline, almost no non-combat activities. It took 4 years to get proper guilds, and instead of new expansions, players had to straight up buy a new copy of the game every couple years and start fresh before they could reach the new content. And yet, despite all of that, for a few short years, it managed to be the most popular online RPG in the world. The truth was, PSO didn't need any of those things, because it used what it did have to push the console hardware of 2000 to its absolute limits, and not just replicate, but improve upon the gameplay of past online RPGs. PSO made actual MMO developers take gamepads seriously as a primary input. Its in-depth character creator pushed studios to try and outdo it, and its loot-driven online-offline gameplay loop helped to inspire a whole subgenre of multiplayer RPGs featuring the likes of Monster Hunter, God Eater, and Ragnarok Odyssey. Phantasy Star Online's ultimate legacy is still undefined. Shortly after its Blue Burst updated re-release, Sega announced Phantasy Star Universe as the game's successor for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox 360. Universe launched in 2006 and quickly gained steam internationally as one of the earliest online games for the 360, but just as quickly fell out of favor due to a combination of factors. Most memorably, its terrible crafting system, wherein the player would spend hours farming for specific materials only for their crafting attempt to fail and all of the required items be destroyed, but also because of predatory subscription practices that made it as hard to cancel as legally possible. The Universe branding lasted a good deal longer than the game itself, surviving in the PSP games Phantasy Star Portable, Portable 2, and Portable 2 Infinity, and alongside these titles Sega created Phantasy Star Zero to capitalize on the mass success of the Nintendo DS, revisiting many of the core concepts out of the original PSO, including its previously unexplored homeworld planet, Coral. They finally pulled the plug on Universe in North America in 2010, and gradually shut down the different Japanese servers in 2011 and 2012, shifting their focus to a new game, Phantasy Star Online 2. Aside from some infamous localization problems that kept the game Japan only for 8 years, PSO2's main claim to fame was its monetization structure. Instead of a subscription fee like all past PSO games had, PSO2 was one of the early Japanese games to embrace a gacha system, in which the player paid real money for in-game ARX cash and spent their ARX cash rolling for random cosmetic items in a virtual gachapon machine. This system was fed by crossovers with popular anime, manga, and video game franchises, and players shelled out almost endlessly to dress up their in-game avatars. The gacha system was supplemented by the Premium Set, which was effectively an opt-in subscription fee whereby paying the fee, players would get access to item trading with other subscribing players, the ability to open their own shops, housing expansions, increased login bonuses, and access to subscriber-only blocks of their ship to avoid congestion during peak hours. PSO2 is still an evolving game, and one which merits its own separate discussion. But it is fair to say that none of these sequels made everyone turn around and pay attention in the way that PSO did. Sega fought a losing battle from the start with the Dreamcast, a battle that it fought alone, in the dirt, against an enemy it was doomed to be defeated by. But the most profound thing about it was how it made everybody else watch. In 2 years, Sega pushed out Sonic Adventure and Adventure 2, Crazy Taxi, Shenmue and Shenmue 2, Skies of Arcadia, and Phantasy Star Online. Any one of these games could have been a console's best game, but the Dreamcast was distinguished by how it seemed like nearly every new game could be the best game ever made. Sega's chairman and longtime supporter Okawa Isao died on March 16, 2001, after a long and arduous battle with cancer. The dream died with him. As per his orders, Sega discontinued the Dreamcast at the end of that month. But neither of them went gently. Thanks in large part to Okawa's efforts, everybody in the industry knew what the Dreamcast was, everybody felt it when the last console rolled off the line, and every game developer in the world was taking notes. Okawa firmly believed in the Dreamcast as the online console of its generation, and personally backed this both by covering Sega's immense debt from the Saturn era with a $500 million loan out of his own money that he later forgave in its entirety, and by personally paying for a year's worth of internet for every Japanese Dreamcast owner. His idea of what this console could be, as a centerpiece for online multiplayer, downloadable content, and web browsing, found its way into every subsequent console of the next generation. And those facets were embodied by PSO, which, more than any of the Dreamcast's other online games, tried to be a destination for players to meet, connect, and adventure with one another.